Marble glistened under the Mediterranean sun. Golden chariots rolled past temples dedicated to gods of wisdom and virtue. Senators in silk and gold debated the nature of justice as fountains spilled crystal water into marble basins. Rome, the empire that called itself the light of the world. To the poets and sculptors, it was civilization perfected, law, order, beauty, reason. But behind the statues and speeches, behind every triumphal arch, something darker breathed. Because beneath Rome's marble mask was a world built on human flesh, an empire that sang of virtue while feasting on misery. For every senator who quoted Cicero, there were 10 slaves polishing his floors. For every feast that glittered under torchlight, there were women beaten to prepare it. Millions of enslaved people, many stolen from Greece, Egypt, Gaul, and Africa, labored unseen, unheard, and unremembered. Their backs bore the weight of Rome's glory, their silence the sound of its perfection. The Romans called their empire a miracle, Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. But peace for whom? The same city that worshipped Venus, goddess of love, auctioned women like livestock. The same civilization that built the Colosseum for entertainment filled it with blood. And in the name of discipline, law, and divinity, it carved pain into its foundations. To be a female slave in Rome was to live without a name, property, not person. Her womb belonged to her master, her body, his right, her voice, forbidden. Even her suffering was measured not in mercy, but in value, how much she was worth alive, and how useful her body could be broken. Rome loved to call itself eternal, but eternity, for those who served it, meant an unending cycle of cruelty disguised as culture. This is the empire that gave the world its laws, its art, its language, and its hypocrisy. An empire that saw itself as divine, yet treated its daughters as disposable. And as we walk deeper into its heart, the illusion of grandeur begins to decay. The mosaics fade, the marble cracks, and beneath we find the truth, that Rome's civilization was not built by gods, but by hands that bled. Because every empire hides its sins behind beauty. And Rome, the greatest of them all, was also the most beautiful lie. To understand the cruelty of Rome, you must first understand its law. The Romans were obsessed with order, every act, every life, every death recorded in the name of justice. Yet within that order lay a terrifying truth. Some lives were not lives at all. In the language of Roman law, a female slave was not homo, a person, but res, a thing, a talking tool, as Aristotle once wrote. Her status was property, her worth measured in denarii, her existence defined entirely by the will of her master. The law gave him vitae necisque potestas, the power of life and death. If he struck her dead, it was not murder. If he raped her, it was not defilement. It was, in the eyes of the law, an act of ownership. Roman jurists justified this with divine logic. The gods themselves, they said, had decreed hierarchy. Jupiter ruled Olympus, men ruled women, masters ruled slaves. To challenge this order was to offend the gods. And so, cruelty became sacred. Philosophers, even those considered wise, defended this nightmare. Seneca, the Stoic moralist, wrote that slaves should be treated as friends, yet reminded masters they were still property. Pliny admired the loyalty of his slaves, yet his letters show he punished them for the smallest disobedience. Compassion was encouraged only as long as it preserved the master's dignity. And in Rome, dignity belonged only to the powerful. Even religion conspired in silence. Priests blessed public punishments as acts of purification, the whip, the brand, the execution, all seen as offerings to appease divine justice. A woman's suffering could cleanse her master's sins. The more she bled, the more the gods were satisfied. In this twisted system, cruelty was not hidden, it was codified, engraved into tablets, chanted by lawyers, praised by philosophers. The empire's conscience was carved from marble, cold and unfeeling. Imagine for a moment what this meant for a young girl captured in war, torn from her village, sold in the market, stripped of her name, her body no longer her own, her future erased by a decree she could not read. Every act of violence against her had a signature, not of passion, but of law. Rome called it civilization. But to the enslaved woman, it was a prison without walls. Even when freed, she could never truly escape the brand of servitude. The law remembered. Her children bore her shame. Her past, like the iron collar once around her neck, left marks that could never fade. This was the true machinery of empire, not armies or senators, but rules that turned mercy into weakness and obedience into virtue. And as we descend further into the heart of this system, we leave the marble halls of law for the private chambers of Rome's elite, where cruelty wore perfume and punishment wore silk. Because in the Roman household, domination wasn't written in law, it was carved into flesh. Behind the marble columns of Rome's villas, where incense drifted through courtyards and music filled the air, another kind of theater unfolded, unseen, unspoken, and unsparing. The domus, or Roman household, was not just a home, it was a kingdom. And within its walls, the master was both God and executioner. Here, punishment was not an event, it was routine. Discipline was the rhythm of survival. A woman who moved too slowly, who spoke too loudly, who looked too long at her master's son, could be lashed, starved, or branded without hesitation. Branding was common, a searing iron pressed against flesh, marking the face, shoulder, or thigh with letters like FVG for fugitiva, runaway. The mark was permanent, a scarlet announcement that she belonged to someone. In the kitchens, the slaves' quarters were small, damp, and filled with the smell of smoke and sweat. Meals were leftovers, eaten standing. They slept on straw, their bodies trembling at every footstep above. And when the master descended, whether in anger or lust, they had no choice but to kneel. Sex was not intimacy, it was domination. To a Roman master, a female slave's body was an extension of his estate, to be used, traded, or discarded. Ancient letters describe slaves forced to serve at table by day and in bed by night. Some were gifted to guests as tokens of hospitality. Others were punished through violation, their humiliation enjoyed as entertainment. In the luxurious homes of the patricians, cruelty became art. There are accounts, whispered in Roman letters, of slaves whipped for spilling wine, of others burned with lamps for failing to warm a bath on time. One master ordered his slave girl's tongue cut out for talking back. Another crucified his servant in the garden so the other slaves could learn obedience. And yet, these same masters prided themselves on taste, quoting poetry as they tortured, admiring marble statues of Venus while defiling the living women who cleaned them. The more cultured the Roman, the more creative the cruelty. Roman poets themselves blurred the line between beauty and brutality. Ovid, in his verses, spoke of love as conquest, a language that mirrored the empire's own appetites. Pleasure and punishment intertwined until even the gods seemed complicit. For many enslaved women, survival meant silence. They learned to smile while trembling, to obey before being asked, to hide their thoughts so deeply that even pain could not find them. In their world, resistance was suicide, and submission the only shield. Still, some found small acts of rebellion, breaking a vase on purpose, poisoning food, whispering prayers to forbidden gods. Tiny moments of defiance that reminded them they were still human. But Rome had no patience for disobedience. Punishment was both private discipline and public message, a reminder to every servant that power flowed in one direction only. And in this way, cruelty kept the empire stable. Fear was its foundation, and obedience its art. As silk curtains fluttered and lyres played in the atrium, the sound of lashes echoed below. Above, laughter. Below, screams. The empire of refinement was also an empire of flesh. And when cruelty could no longer be contained within the household, when punishment became too grand, too spectacular for private walls, Rome took it to the stage. Rome did not hide its cruelty, it celebrated it. If the household was a private hell, the arena was the empire's altar. Here, the suffering of the enslaved was transformed into theater, and punishment became spectacle. At dawn, the crowds gathered. Tens of thousands filled the amphitheaters, dressed in bright tunics, their faces painted with excitement. Vendors sold honey cakes and olives. Children climbed their fathers' shoulders, and the air buzzed with anticipation. This was not mere justice, it was entertainment. When the gates opened, the condemned were driven in, men, women, even children. Among them, countless enslaved women, some accused of rebellion, others of poisoning their masters, many guilty only of defiance. They were stripped naked before the roaring crowd. Their names were shouted, mocked, erased. To the Romans, their humiliation was part of the ritual, a cleansing of order through public suffering. Then came damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Cages were opened, and lions, leopards, and bears rushed forth, starved and furious. The women ran, screamed, prayed, and were torn apart under the sun. But even this horror was choreographed. Rome turned execution into art. The deaths were staged as reenactments of myth. A slave woman might be dressed as Leda, embraced by a swan, or as Europa, devoured by a bull, or as Dirce, tied to the horns of a raging ox. Every punishment was a performance, a grotesque parody of beauty. The philosopher Seneca once described such spectacles without flinching. In the morning, men are thrown to the lions and bears. At noon, to their spectators. To him, the games were moral instruction, cruelty disguised as virtue. And so, Rome taught its citizens that suffering was divine and that order required blood. Sometimes, before execution, a woman would be publicly violated. Her degradation meant to complete the act of punishment. The arena became a temple of submission, where even death could not cleanse her shame. For those watching, it was proof of Rome's might. For those dying, it was the final theft of dignity. Yet, behind the cheers and the pageantry, there was fear. The masters watched too, and remembered what would happen if their own slaves ever rebelled. The arena was not just for the crowd's pleasure, it was a warning. The empire ran on terror, and terror had to be seen. In one account, a slave woman was executed for murdering her mistress. The entire household, hundreds of slaves, was ordered to watch as the woman was flogged, raped, and thrown to the beasts. Afterwards, the emperor commended the spectacle as justice fulfilled. Rome's citizens left these shows cleansed, convinced that their empire was righteous. They returned home to their villas, their feasts, their baths, never questioning that the marble under their feet was stained red. The Colosseum still stands today, silent, magnificent, eternal. But its stones remember. They remember the screams buried beneath applause, the echoes of bodies breaking, the laughter of those who watched. And as we leave the arena's shadow, we follow the few who dared to run, the ones who refused to kneel, who risked everything for a freedom Rome said they did not deserve. Because in an empire of obedience, defiance itself became the most unforgivable sin. In a world where obedience was survival, defiance was death. For Rome's enslaved women, rebellion came in many forms: a hidden look of hatred, a whispered curse, a drop of poison. But every act, no matter how small, carried the same sentence: terror. Runaway slaves, fugitivi, were the empire's obsession. The thought that property might think, plot, and flee ignited panic among masters. When caught, these women were dragged through the streets, their ankles bound in chains, their faces branded again, this time not for ownership, but for shame. Iron collars were locked around their necks, engraved with messages like, "I have fled. Capture me and return me to my master." The collars gleamed in the sunlight, a walking proclamation of defeat. Those who fled again faced punishments that bordered on ritual torture. Some were whipped until their bones showed, others crucified along roads leading to the city, their bodies swaying in the Roman wind as warnings to the living. After the great slave revolt of Spartacus, Rome's paranoia deepened. Even a whisper of insubordination could spark brutal retribution. Fear became policy. Every runaway woman was not just a fugitive, she was a potential spark in a field of dry grass. And then came the darker accusations: witchcraft, poison, rebellion of the soul. When a master fell ill or a noble's child died mysteriously, suspicion often fell on the women who served them. Slave women were easy scapegoats. They were tortured until they confessed, their words twisted into guilt. Roman historians record such cases with cold detachment. Women burned alive for brewing herbs, crucified for whispering prayers, flayed for predicting death. To the Romans, these were not women seeking justice or survival. They were threats to order, agents of chaos. Yet, behind every confession was agony. The quaestio, or interrogation, used racks, hooks, and fire. Truth did not matter, only the performance of submission. And when the condemned finally broke, Rome declared itself righteous. Still, rebellion persisted. Some poisoned their masters and vanished into the countryside. Others joined bands of fugitives, ghost communities that haunted the edges of empire, surviving on theft and memory. Their names never entered history, but their defiance lived on as whispers, carried by traders and slaves alike. Someone escaped. For Rome, that was the greatest fear, not war, not famine, but the thought that its slaves could dream of freedom, that the bodies it branded could still belong to themselves. So it doubled its punishments, turned cruelty into spectacle, and called it peace. But peace built on terror is only silence waiting to break. And when it did, it left behind an empire haunted, not by its gods, but by the ghosts of the broken who once served them. Centuries have passed since the last Roman whip cracked the air, since the last body fell beneath the roar of the crowd. The empire crumbled, its marble faded, its gods forgotten. Yet, Rome never truly died. It changed its form. For the world inherited more than its roads and laws. It inherited its hierarchy, its hunger for control. The Roman way of dividing the strong from the weak, the powerful from the powerless, seeped quietly into the bloodstream of civilization. Empires that followed borrowed its language of order, its worship of dominance cloaked as discipline. Even now, the ghosts remain, in the language of conquest, in the idea that some are born to rule while others are born to serve. The same logic that once justified chains found new names: civilization, progress, profit. And though the arenas have fallen silent, the memory endures, a reminder that greatness built on cruelty is only another form of decay. The Romans believed they were eternal, and in a way, they were. For every society that prizes wealth over mercy, power over empathy, still carries the echo of their empire. The marble may be gone, the gold may have dulled, but the silence of the enslaved, their unseen, unspoken suffering, still hums beneath history's surface. Rome's true legacy was never its architecture, its legions, or its glory. It was the idea that civilization could wear a mask, that beneath beauty, cruelty could hide, polished and eternal. And if you listen closely, in the ruins and the dust, you can still hear them, the whispers of the empire's forgotten daughters, reminding us that the line between order and barbarity has always been thinner than marble.